Shabbat Shalom. In this week's Torah reading, we find ourselves smack dab in the middle of Genesis with yet another familiar story. We read this week that a famine forces one of our patriarchs to travel from his home to the more fertile land of Gerar. When he arrives, he lies to the king Avimelech, saying that his wife is really his sister, out of fear that the Philistines would kill him to get to her. He digs a well, he sets up tents, and he amasses wealth. And towards the end of the parsha, he calls out for his son, who responds, Hineni, here I am. Reading Parshat Tol'dot, you get the eerie feeling that you've been here before, more recently than just this time last year. Because in the past few weeks, we have indeed read some of these exact same plot devices, at least one of the same exact characters, and some of the same exact Hebrew phrasing about Abraham. But this week, the protagonist is Isaac. You don't even have to read that closely to realize that Isaac just repeats much of what his father does earlier in Genesis. And this is one of the many ways in which Isaac gets short shrift in our tradition. He's most famous for being bound to an altar by his father, and nearly as famous for being incapable of seeing his son Jacob, tricking him into giving Jacob his blessing. This parsha is the only one where we find Isaac as a grown man. But on the surface, he doesn't have a whole lot going for him. And even in adulthood, Isaac can't seem to do much more than replicate his father's actions. Vayashav Yitzchak v'yachpor et be'erot hamayim asher chafru b'mei Abraham aviv. Isaac dug anew the wells which had been dug in the days of his father Abraham. He can't even dig his own original wells. To be more charitable to Isaac, though, there might be more that meets the eye about him redigging his father's wells. For one thing, they might have been especially awesome wells. But my sense is that these wells are a metaphor for something else. I like to imagine that when Isaac revisits these wells, he's plumbing the depths of his relationship with his father, which, as we know, was complicated. Time and again, Isaac returns to his father's life, perhaps with an intention to do things differently, or maybe even better than his father did. We can probably relate to this. How many of us have tried to revisit our parents' behaviors and considered how we might do things differently? How many of us have felt plagued by something that happened in childhood, which we feel doomed to play over and over again in our minds, or perhaps even repeat in our own behaviors? Hopefully, we never endured something quite as traumatic as Isaac did on the altar. But indeed, just as we replay those memories in our own minds, many commentators point out that Isaac was plagued for life by that early encounter with his father. Rabbi teaches that Isaac became blind on the altar when angels wept on his behalf, and their tears fell into his eyes. His blindness was the direct result of his trauma. As we know, this inability to see physically gets in the way of Isaac distinguishing between his own two sons. But perhaps the very fact of not being able to see in the conventional way caused him to see in other ways, to look inward, unpacking all that had happened to him, digging and redigging the wells of his father for answers, an act of introspection. Examining this parsha, a 19th century Hasidic sage known as the Sfat Emet just can't leave well enough alone. He teaches that in the book of Genesis, a well is rarely just a well, emphasizing the fact that the Hebrew for well, be'er, also means to explain. At the beginning of Deuteronomy, for example, the word is used to say that Moses agreed to explain be'er, the Torah. The Sfat Emet makes this connection to say that even before Moses explained the Torah by giving it to the Israelites, even before the Torah was given as a complete unit at Mount Sinai, the patriarchs of Genesis intuited Torah from their own lives. In his view, there was a Torah before the Torah, which existed in the insights and lived experiences of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The Sfat Emet points to 3 cases of wells in the patriarch stories to demonstrate the unique wisdom that each forefather espoused. He reads the wells of the patriarchs to be symbols of how a person can draw out wisdom from their own lives, wisdom of love, of fear, and of truth, respectively. And in fact, only after the patriarchs draw out this sort of wisdom can the Torah be given to a later generation of their descendants. Remarkably, he says, if both Torah wisdom and the wisdom that comes from life itself are equally important, we can't forget that the wisdom gleaned from one's own life is the one that emerges first. It's so beautiful to hear from Hasidic Rabbi that traditional texts and lived experiences are both fonts of wisdom. And with this in mind, we can read that Isaac's wisdom, his explanation, his Torah, is bound up in his own revisiting of his past. So it may be for us, revisiting the wells of our parents, redigging our relationships, in hopes of learning some explanation for why we think or feel or act the way we do. When we probe ourselves in this way, sometimes it feels like we are doomed, that early memories will dictate our every move forever. And sometimes it feels like we're just revisiting the same well all the time, and nothing's ever different about it. But maybe it's not so bleak. In Isaac's story, there are some dimensions that do not appear in the story of his father, some things in his life that really do belong only to him. And in fact, even in the process of redigging his father's wells, something happens to him that doesn't appear in the story about Abraham. After Isaac redigs the first well, the Philistines in that land get upset and claim that the water is not rightfully his. He redigs a second well, again provoking the Philistines' ire. But before redigging a third well, Isaac moves to a different place. And in fact, digging this third well presents no problem at all. So he says, "Now at last the Eternal One has granted us ample space." In this case, he's still redigging the wells, but he's doing it in a different space. The verb used to describe his movement is only ever used in the Torah, actually, to describe Abraham and Isaac. The action is something that binds them together, but the plot is different. It seems the text is hinting to us that even though Isaac remains bound to the memory of his father's actions, Isaac's process of introspection eventually works out for him, at least a little bit. And after he tries a few times in pursuit of that wisdom, eventually he gets to a place that is rachov, that is expansive to him, a place where he can live freely. Isaac may be less famous than his idol-smashing father or his angel-wrestling son, but as a redigger of wells, he claims his role as one of Breshit's big three, and he inspires us to keep revisiting and digging our own wells. And though it may feel like all we do is revisit the same wells over and over, perhaps we too will get to a place that is expansive. Shabbat Shalom.